The legacy of Herbert Hoover began with the election of 1928. With Calvin Coolidge choosing not to run for a second term, the United States needed a new president. Herbert Hoover was the Republican nominee, and the governor at the time from New York, by the name of Al Smith, was the Democratic nominee. Both nominees were widely known and very popular prior to the 1928 election. Hoover won the election by quite a large margin, receiving votes from every state but five: Rhode Island, Iowa, North Dakota, South Carolina, and Tennessee. He won, receiving 58.21% of the votes, with his opposition only receiving 40.79%. On March 4th, 1929, Hoover was inaugurated as the 31st President of the United States. The first thing that he did as president was call a special session of Congress. In this session, the Agricultural Marketing Act was passed. This established a federal farm board that worked to stabilize agricultural and farming prices. This was a very good move because it gave the backbone of society at the time a reason to continue growing their produce, because they knew that they were always going to be paid for what they grew. Hoover was a relatively high believer in laissez-faire. He believed that cooperation between public and private circles would lead to a strong, independent economy. This, in turn, would allow Americans to be more independent and self-reliant. But these ideals were put to the test on October 24th, 1929, the day the stock market crashed. This was and would be one of the greatest hits the U.S. economy would ever take, and it happened only 8 months into Hoover's presidency. This day is referred to as Black Tuesday. This was the catalyst that started a 10-year Great Depression. However, the stock market crash wasn't the only thing to contribute to the Depression. Prior to the Depression, a total of 9,000 banks failed, and people's money was uninsured. Therefore, they lost all their savings. Because people didn't have money, they had to stop purchasing items, which in turn caused production to slow and people to lose their jobs. When business began to fail, Hoover tried to help by creating the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. This encouraged people to buy only things that were American-made. Since the U.S. was giving this example, it made the rest of the world do it, which in turn made trade with other countries come almost to a standstill. The Depression affected the economy tremendously, and President Hoover had to come up with ways to help rebuild it. Even with the continual decline of the economy, Hoover refused to give federal or direct federal relief payments to individuals. He feared that they would become too reliant on the government's assistance and wouldn't have any reason to work. Instead of providing direct relief, he pursued many policies. These were designed to provide relief to those who needed it without directly providing relief to the individual. 3 of the many policies that he passed were as follows. Number 1, the Mexican Repatriation Act. This program helped. It forced thousands of Mexican immigrants back to Mexico and reduced the size of the overall population and opened up jobs for many Americans. Number 2 was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. As stated above, this made it a whole lot worse. This act urged Americans to buy only American-made goods and caused trade to come to almost to a standstill with the rest of the world. And finally, number 3, the Hoover Moratorium Act. This helped. This put a 1-year stop on payments of World War I and other war debt, postponing the initial payments as well as interest. However, this made Hoover even less popular. Because of the Depression hitting so soon into Hoover's presidency, he is widely blamed for it. During the Depression, little shanty towns made up of shacks started popping up all over the map. They were created by homeless people who lost everything in the Depression. These were called Hoovervilles. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in these quote-unquote Hoovervilles. They were named after President Hoover because everyone thought that he was responsible for the Great Depression. The Depression struck after World War I and put many service members out on the street. After the war, they were promised compensation for their service, but didn't get any. They were fine with this, however, because they were doing fine and they were living a comfortable life. But when the Depression hit, they needed the money, so they went and protested outside of the White House. This march is known as the Bonus March, and the army was referred to as the Bonus Army. When asked to leave, they wouldn't, so the U.S. Army had to intervene and force them to leave. Because of this, Hoover became a very hated individual. During his presidency, Hoover did do one thing right. He started the construction of the Hoover Dam. The dam created a border between Arizona and Nevada. Its construction was started in 1931 by Herbert Hoover and was finished in 1936 by Franklin Roosevelt, the next president. There's a lot of controversy on if the dam was named after Hoover, but the general assumption is that it was. After a long 4 miserable years, it was finally time for another presidential election, and the people could not be more happy. In the midst of the Great Depression, a new figure emerged in the form of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the well-known New York governor. He beat out Hoover in the 1932 election and became the new president. Hoover's legacy, as sad as it is, will be remembered as him starting the Great Depression.